88-year-old veteran speeds to feed grandkids. Judge Caprio's legendary verdict goes viral. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the Providence Municipal Court building as another Tuesday began in Rhode Island's legal system. It was mid-November, and the crisp autumn air carried the promise of winter, along with the familiar sounds of a city awakening to face another day of challenges, hopes, and the countless small dramas that make up the fabric of community life. Inside, the courthouse Judge Frank Caprio sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket with the same careful attention he had brought to every morning for over 3 decades. At 84 years old, his passion for justice burned as brightly as ever, tempered by decades of wisdom and an unwavering commitment to treating every person who appeared before his bench with dignity, respect, and genuine compassion. The walls of Frank's chambers told the story of a life dedicated to service. Photographs with community leaders, letters of gratitude from families whose lives had been touched by his unique approach to justice, and awards recognizing his contributions to both the legal profession and the broader community. But perhaps most prominently displayed were pictures of his own family. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who reminded him daily of what truly mattered in life: love, family, and the responsibility to care for those who depend on us. Frank's Italian-American heritage had instilled in him values that went far deeper than legal precedent. His understanding of family obligation, respect for elders, and the importance of community support had shaped his judicial philosophy in ways that made his courtroom a place where law and humanity intersected to create something beautiful and healing. He had never forgotten his own family's immigrant journey, the struggles they had faced, and the kindness of others that had made their American dream possible. As Frank reviewed the morning's cases, one entry caught his attention and held it. The defendant was listed as Robert Bobby Martinez, age 88, cited for excessive speed on Route 95, traveling 78 miles in a 55-mile zone. The violation had occurred at 6:47 p.m. on a Sunday evening, an unusual time for typical speeding infractions that usually involved younger drivers rushing to work or appointments during business hours. Frank paused, his pen hovering over the case. A file. An 88-year-old man speeding on a Sunday evening. This immediately suggested circumstances that went beyond simple traffic violations. In his experience, when elderly drivers were cited for speeding, there were often compelling human stories behind the violations. Emergency medical situations, family crises, or other urgent circumstances that had prompted normally cautious elderly drivers to exceed speed limits they typically observed meticulously. The courthouse began to fill with its usual morning assembly of citizens, attorneys, and court officials. The atmosphere carried the typical tension that pervaded any legal setting: people facing judgment, consequences, and the uncertainty that came with appearing before the formal machinery of justice. But Frank's courtroom had always been different, transformed by his approach into a place where people felt heard, understood, and treated with the respect that every human being deserved. Court officers took their positions, recognizing in Frank's demeanor the signs of a judge who was particularly focused and engaged. They had worked with him long enough to know when a case had captured his special attention, and they could sense that today would bring something significant. Frank's ability to see beyond legal technicalities to the human stories underneath had made him not just an effective judge, but a healing presence in the community. As the morning session began, Frank handled the early cases with his characteristic blend of legal expertise and genuine concern for the people before him. A young mother facing parking violations received both education about city regulations and understanding about the challenges of balancing work and childcare. An elderly man confused about new traffic patterns was patiently guided through the changes while being treated with the dignity his years deserved. Each interaction demonstrated Frank's fundamental belief that the courtroom should be a place of education and healing, not just punishment and enforcement. His warm smile, patient explanations, and obvious concern for each person's well-being had transformed countless lives and had earned him a reputation that extended far beyond Rhode Island's borders. As the time approached for Bobby Martinez's case, Frank found himself preparing mentally and emotionally for what he sensed would be a significant encounter. The sparse details in the case file, an 88-year-old veteran speeding on a Sunday evening, suggested a story that would require all of his experience, wisdom, and compassion to address properly. The courtroom doors opened to admit Bobby Martinez, and Frank immediately felt his heart stirred by what he observed. The defendant was a small-statured man, probably no more than 5'6", with the careful movements and dignified bearing that often characterized military veterans well into their advanced years. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite what were obviously his best clothes, a clean but worn button-down shirt, pressed slacks, and polished shoes that had seen better days, there was an unmistakable aura of pride and self-respect about him. But it was Bobby's eyes that most captured Frank's attention. They were the eyes of a man who had seen much in his 88 years. Military service, decades of work, the joys and sorrows of family life, and the inevitable challenges that came with advanced age. Yet they remained alert and intelligent, reflecting a spirit that had not been diminished by the passage of time or the difficulties that life had surely brought. Bobby made his way carefully down the courtroom aisle, his movements deliberate but steady. He carried a small folder of documents and walked with the erect posture of someone whose military training had instilled habits of discipline and respect that had lasted a lifetime. Despite the circumstances that had brought him to court, he maintained his dignity and showed no sign of the defiance or irritation that sometimes characterized traffic court defendants. As Bobby took his place at the defendant's table, Frank could see the careful attention he paid to arranging his few belongings, the folder of papers, a pair of reading glasses, and what appeared to be a small photograph that he placed discreetly beside his documents. The photograph, Frank could glimpse from his elevated position, seemed to show children, probably Bobby's grandchildren, given the loving care with which he had placed the picture within easy view. The presence of that photograph immediately told Frank volumes about why Bobby was here and what motivated his actions. This was not simply a traffic violation case. This was about family, about the responsibilities that grandparents felt toward their grandchildren, and about the lengths to which loving family members would go to ensure that those they cared about were protected and provided for. Bobby's demeanor as he settled into his chair was one of quiet respect, mixed with obvious concern about the proceedings. His hands showed the slight tremor common to his age, but they remained steady as he opened his folder and reviewed the documents he had brought. Here was a man who understood the seriousness of appearing in court and who had prepared himself as thoroughly as possible for whatever consequences he might face. Judge Caprio observed Bobby's careful preparation with growing admiration. Despite his advanced age and the stress of facing legal proceedings, the elderly veteran had taken care to dress appropriately, bring relevant documentation, and conduct himself with the dignity and respect that the court deserved. This was clearly a man who understood civic responsibility and who approached even difficult situations with honor and integrity. As the court clerk prepared to call Bobby's case, Frank found himself thinking about his own grandchildren and the profound love that grandparents felt for the next generation. He understood the protective instincts that drove grandparents to extraordinary measures when their grandchildren's well-being was at stake. The photograph Bobby had carefully placed beside his papers suggested that this case would be about far more than simple speed limits or traffic enforcement. The judge could see in Bobby's posture and preparation the same attention to duty and respect for authority that had probably characterized his military service decades earlier. This was a man who had served his country, raised a family, and continued to feel deep responsibility for those he loved, even as he faced the challenges and limitations that came with being nearly 90 years old. Frank prepared himself for what he sensed would be one of the most meaningful cases of his long career, a case where the formal requirements of traffic law would intersect with the timeless values of family love, sacrifice, and the responsibilities that connect generations. Bobby Martinez's speeding violation was about to become a window into the heart of an elderly veteran whose love for his grandchildren had motivated actions that brought him before the court, seeking understanding and justice. As the clerk's voice echoed through the courtroom announcing Robert Martinez, Frank leaned forward slightly, his expression conveying the warmth and respect that had made him beloved throughout the community. This was why he had dedicated his life to the law. For moments like this, when human stories intersected with legal procedures to create opportunities for compassion, understanding, and the kind of justice that healed rather than simply punished. When Bobby Martinez's case was called, the 88-year-old veteran rose slowly from his seat with the careful precision of someone whose body had served faithfully for nearly 9 decades. His movements were deliberate but determined, reflecting the military discipline that had shaped his character for over 70 years since he first enlisted as a young man during the Korean War era. As he approached the podium, every person in the courtroom seemed to sense they were about to witness something significant, a story that would reveal the depths of family love and the sacrifices that grandparents make for those they cherish most. Judge Frank Caprio's voice, when he addressed Bobby, carried the special warmth he reserved for elderly veterans and community elders. Frank's tone immediately established that this would not be a routine traffic court proceeding, but rather a respectful conversation between two men who understood that life's realities were often far more complex than legal statutes could capture. Bobby straightened his shoulders and began to share his story with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire adult life. His voice, though aged, carried clearly through the courtroom, commanding attention not through volume, but through the unmistakable ring of authenticity and heartfelt concern. As he spoke, the photograph of his grandchildren remained visible on the table beside him, a constant reminder of the motivation behind his actions. The elderly veteran explained that he was the primary caregiver for his 2 grandchildren, Maria, age 8, and Carlos, age 6, who had been living with him for the past 2 years following a series of family tragedies that had left them without their parents. Their mother, Bobby's daughter, had died in a car accident, and their father had struggled with addiction issues that made him unable to provide the stable home environment the children needed. Bobby's voice carried both pride and deep concern, as he described how he had stepped forward without hesitation to take custody of Maria and Carlos, despite his advanced age and limited income. At 86 years old, when the children came to live with him, Bobby had transformed his quiet retirement into an active, challenging but deeply rewarding second career as a full-time parent to 2 energetic young children who had already experienced more loss and instability than any child should face. The veteran explained that his modest social security check, combined with a small military pension, provided just enough income to cover basic necessities: rent for their small apartment, utilities, and the countless expenses that came with raising children. He had learned to budget carefully, shop for bargains, and make every dollar stretch as far as possible, but there were times when unexpected expenses or the simple reality of growing children's needs created financial challenges that tested his resourcefulness. Judge Caprio listened intently as Bobby described his daily routine with the children. Despite his age, he had learned to navigate the complex world of elementary school schedules, homework assistance, medical appointments, and all the responsibilities that came with raising young children in the 21st century. He had discovered the energy that comes from love and necessity, finding strength he didn't know he possessed to meet the demands of active grandchildren who depended on him for everything. Bobby's eyes lit up with obvious affection as he described Maria's love of reading and Carlos's passion for building with blocks and toy cars. These children had brought joy and purpose back into his life after the loneliness that had followed his wife's death several years earlier. But they had also brought challenges that sometimes stretched his capabilities to their limits, particularly when it came to providing the kind of abundant, worry-free childhood he wished he could give them. The speeding violation, Bobby explained, had occurred on a Sunday evening when he had suddenly realized that the children had very little food in the apartment for the coming week. His Social Security check wasn't due until Wednesday, but the children needed meals for school lunches and dinners that couldn't wait. The local food bank, where he sometimes supplemented their groceries, was closed on Sundays, leaving him with few options for addressing the immediate crisis. Frank could see the pain in Bobby's eyes as he recounted the moment when 8-year-old Maria had looked in the refrigerator and asked if they would have breakfast the next morning. The innocent question from a child who had already lost so much had struck Bobby like a physical blow, awakening every protective instinct and driving him to take action regardless of the potential consequences. Bobby had made the difficult decision to drive to a grocery store that stayed open late on Sundays, using the small emergency fund he kept hidden in a coffee can. Money saved penny by penny from his monthly budget for exactly this kind of situation. But the store was nearly 25 miles away, and by the time he realized how late it was getting and how hungry the children would be, he found himself driving faster than he normally would, focused entirely on getting home with food before the children went to bed, worried about tomorrow's meals. The elderly veteran's voice broke slightly as he described his mindset during that drive. All he could think about were those two little faces looking up at him with trust and confidence that Grandpa would always take care of them, would always make sure they had what they needed. The thought of disappointing them, of being unable to provide something as basic as food, had been more than he could bear. Bobby opened his folder and pulled out the receipt from that Sunday evening shopping trip, showing Judge Caprio the careful purchases he had made: bread, milk, peanut butter, canned soup, bananas, and other simple foods that would stretch their budget and provide nutritious meals for the children through the week. Every item had been selected with consideration for both cost and the children's preferences, reflecting the thoughtful care of a grandfather who knew exactly what would make his grandchildren happy and healthy. The receipt told a story of sacrifice and love. An 88-year-old man on a fixed income, spending his emergency money to ensure that his grandchildren would not go hungry, even when it meant he would have to find ways to make his own food last until his next check arrived. The total amount was modest by most standards, but Frank could see that for Bobby, it represented a significant portion of his available resources. Bobby's narrative revealed the daily challenges of raising children on such a limited budget. He described learning to cook simple meals that the children enjoyed, finding free activities at the local library and community center, and making their small apartment feel like a loving home despite the financial constraints. His pride in the children's academic success and their resilience in the face of their early losses was evident in every word. The veteran also spoke about the support he received from their small community, neighbors who occasionally watched, The children, teachers who understood their situation and provided extra encouragement, and the local church that had helped with school supplies and winter clothing. Bobby's gratitude for this assistance was obvious, but so was his determination to remain as independent as possible and to be the provider and protector his grandchildren needed. Judge Caprio could see that Bobby's speeding violation was not an act of carelessness or disregard for the law, but rather the desperate action of a loving grandfather who had found himself racing against time and circumstances to fulfill his most basic responsibility, ensuring that the children in his care had food to eat. The violation represented not criminal intent, but the kind of sacrifice and urgency that love created when faced with a child's need. As Bobby concluded his explanation, he looked directly at Judge Caprio with eyes that held both vulnerability and dignity. He made it clear that he was not seeking to avoid responsibility for his actions, but rather hoped that the court would understand the circumstances that had led to his violation. He was prepared to accept whatever consequences the law required, but he wanted the judge to know that his actions had been motivated not by selfishness or disrespect, but by the deepest love and sense of duty that a grandfather could feel. The courtroom remained silent as Bobby's story settled over everyone present. Here was a man who embodied the best values of his generation: military service, family responsibility, and selfless love for children who depended on him. His willingness to risk legal consequences rather than allow his grandchildren to go hungry revealed the depths of devotion that had sustained families and communities for generations. Frank found himself deeply moved by Bobby's testimony and by the sacrifice, love, and dignity the elderly veteran had demonstrated. This was not just about a speeding ticket, it was about the responsibilities that connect generations, the lengths to which loving grandparents will go to protect their grandchildren, and the quiet heroism of elderly people who step forward to care for family members when circumstances demand such sacrifice. Judge Frank Caprio sat in profound contemplation after Bobby Martinez finished sharing his story, the weight of the elderly veteran's testimony settling over the courtroom like a blanket of shared understanding. The judge's decades of experience had taught him to recognize when a case transcended its legal parameters to become something far more significant, a moment where the administration of justice could either honor or diminish the fundamental values that held families and communities together. Frank's eyes remained fixed on Bobby's weathered face, seeing in the 88-year-old grandfather's expression a mixture of dignity, concern, and the unmistakable love that had motivated his actions. The photograph of Maria and Carlos that Bobby had carefully placed beside his documents served as a constant reminder that this case was about far more than traffic violations. It was about the sacred responsibility that grandparents felt toward their grandchildren and the lengths to which love would drive them when children's well-being was at stake. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment that would test not just legal precedent, but the very purpose and meaning of justice itself. Here was a case where the letter of the law and the spirit of human compassion would need to find a way to coexist, where technical violations would need to be weighed against moral imperatives that had sustained families for generations. Judge Caprio's expression reflected the internal dialogue between his legal training and his deeply held beliefs about the role of compassion in the administration of justice. Frank had always believed that great judges were distinguished not just by their knowledge of legal precedent, but by their ability to apply the law in ways that served its deeper purposes, protecting the vulnerable, supporting families, and recognizing that behind every violation was a human being whose circumstances deserved consideration and understanding. Frank's voice, when he finally began to respond, carried a depth of emotion that was immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom. His words were carefully chosen, reflecting not just his legal expertise, but his profound respect for Bobby's situation and his understanding of the values that had motivated the elderly veteran's actions. The judge's tone conveyed recognition of Bobby's dignity, appreciation for his sacrifice, and acknowledgement of the love that had brought him to this moment. Judge Caprio began by addressing Bobby's military service, recognizing the decades of commitment to the country that had shaped the elderly man's character and sense of duty. Frank spoke with obvious personal knowledge about the Korean War era, about the young men who had served their nation during that difficult period, and about the values of service, sacrifice, and responsibility that had defined that generation. The judge's words carried particular weight because they came from someone who clearly understood and appreciated the veteran's background and service. Frank's response then turned to Bobby's role as a grandfather and primary caregiver, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had led an 88-year-old man to take on the full-time responsibility of raising two young children. The judge spoke eloquently about the courage required to step forward when family tragedy struck, about the love that motivated elderly grandparents to sacrifice their retirement comfort for the well-being of their grandchildren, and about the quiet heroism of people like Bobby, who accepted overwhelming challenges because they understood that children's needs came first. The judge's voice grew more passionate as he addressed the broader significance of Bobby's situation. Frank spoke about the economic realities facing elderly people on fixed incomes, about the challenges of raising children in an increasingly expensive world, and about the impossible choices that loving grandparents sometimes faced when resources were limited, but children's needs were immediate and non-negotiable. Judge Caprio's judicial philosophy had always emphasized that laws were meant to serve people, not the other way around. While traffic regulations had important purposes, ensuring public safety and maintaining order on the roads, their application should always be guided by wisdom, compassion, and an understanding of the human circumstances they were meant to address. In Bobby's case, the judge could see clearly that the spirit of traffic safety had been served by a driver who, despite his speed, had operated his vehicle carefully and responsibly in pursuit of a goal that any reasonable person would understand and support. Frank's response also addressed the economic injustice that would result from imposing financial penalties on someone already struggling to provide for his grandchildren on a fixed income. The judge noted that requiring Bobby to pay a fine would effectively punish the very children whose welfare had motivated his actions, creating a perverse outcome where the law would harm the innocent parties it should protect. The judge's voice took on an even more emotional quality as he spoke directly to Bobby about his character and the values he represented. Frank expressed profound admiration for the elderly veteran's willingness to sacrifice his own comfort and security for his grandchildren's well-being, describing Bobby's actions as embodying the best traditions of both military service and family devotion. The judge noted that Bobby's concern for Maria and Carlos represented the kind of intergenerational love and responsibility that formed the foundation of strong communities. Judge Caprio's decision began to take shape as he announced that he was dismissing all charges against Bobby Martinez. But Frank's reasoning went far beyond simple legal mercy. The judge explained that Bobby's actions represented exactly the kind of responsible, loving behavior that society should celebrate rather than punish. The violation had occurred not from carelessness or disrespect for the law, but from the urgency that love created when children's basic needs were at stake. But Judge Caprio was not finished. In a gesture that left the courtroom stunned, Frank announced that he was personally contributing $200 to help Bobby purchase groceries for his grandchildren. The judge explained that while the court could dismiss the legal charges, it could also do something positive to address the underlying situation that had created the violation in the first place. The emotional impact of Judge Caprio's decision was immediate and overwhelming. Bobby's eyes filled with tears as he realized not only that he would face no penalties for his violation, but that this complete stranger, a judge who had no obligation beyond legal duty, was opening his own wallet to help feed Maria and Carlos. The gesture went beyond legal mercy to represent the kind of human compassion that transformed lives and restored faith in the goodness of others. Frank's voice broke slightly with emotion as he continued, explaining that Bobby's story had reminded him of why he had chosen to dedicate his life to the law. The judge spoke of his own grandchildren, of the love he felt for them, and the lengths he would go to protect and provide for them. Bobby's situation had touched something deep in Frank's heart, awakening not just professional sympathy, but personal recognition of the bonds that connected all grandparents to their grandchildren. The judge's decision also included practical elements designed to address Bobby's ongoing challenges. Frank announced that he would be connecting Bobby with local social service organizations that provided assistance to grandparents raising grandchildren, ensuring that the elderly veteran would have access to resources that could help him provide for Maria and Carlos more easily and consistently. Judge Caprio rose from his bench and walked around to meet Bobby personally, eliminating the formal distance between judge and defendant to create a moment of human connection that transcended legal proceedings. Frank's gesture transformed the courtroom from a place of judgment to a place of recognition and support, demonstrating that justice at its finest could celebrate rather than condemn the values that made communities strong. The judge placed his hand on Bobby's shoulder and spoke to him with the gentle respect one would show a beloved grandfather. Frank's words conveyed not just legal resolution, but personal appreciation for Bobby's character, his sacrifice, and his unwavering commitment to his grandchildren's well-being. The moment represented everything that Judge Caprio had tried to achieve throughout his career: the use of legal authority not just to enforce rules, but to support and celebrate the best aspects of human nature. As Frank handed Bobby the money for groceries, the elderly veteran wept openly, overwhelmed by the combination of relief, gratitude, and recognition. What had begun as a legal proceeding that threatened to impose additional financial hardship on an already struggling family had transformed into a moment of community support and human connection that would sustain Bobby and his grandchildren, far beyond the immediate resolution of the traffic citation. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause that continued for several minutes. As everyone present recognized, they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just legal mercy, but active compassion that addressed both the technical requirements of law and the deeper human needs that had created the situation. Bobby's love for his grandchildren had inspired a judicial response that honored both his sacrifice and the values that made families and communities strong. The spontaneous applause that erupted in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom following his extraordinary decision seemed to go on forever, as if everyone present needed time to fully absorb the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Citizens, attorneys, and court staff found themselves united in recognition of something that transcended routine legal proceedings. A moment where compassion had triumphed over technicality, where human need had been met with generous response, and where an elderly veteran's love for his grandchildren had inspired a judicial decision that would be remembered long after the legal paperwork was filed away. Bobby Martinez stood at the podium, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, clutching the $200 that Judge Caprio had personally given him for groceries. The 88-year-old veteran appeared transformed, The worried, careful man who had entered the courtroom had been replaced by someone who radiated relief, gratitude, and a renewed faith in the goodness of others. His hands trembled as he held the money, not from age or nervousness, but from the overwhelming emotion of receiving unexpected kindness when he had prepared himself for punishment and financial hardship. Judge Caprio remained standing beside Bobby, his own eyes bright with tears that reflected both the joy of being able to help and the deep satisfaction that came from using his position to serve justice in its truest form. Frank's decision embodied everything he believed about the law, that it should serve humanity, protect the vulnerable, and recognize the values that sustained families and communities across generations. The transformation in the courtroom atmosphere was remarkable. What had begun as a formal legal proceeding had evolved into something more resembling a community celebration of shared values and mutual support. People in the gallery were openly weeping, moved not just by Bobby's story, but by Judge Caprio's response, which had demonstrated that institutions could indeed be vehicles for compassion and positive change. Bobby's voice, when he finally found words to express his gratitude, was broken with emotion but clear in its sincerity. He spoke of his amazement at encountering such kindness from a complete stranger, his relief at knowing that Maria and Carlos would have food without him facing financial penalties, and his restored faith in a world that sometimes seemed indifferent to the struggles of elderly people on fixed incomes. The elderly veteran expressed particular gratitude for Judge Caprio's understanding of his motivation, noting that the judge's recognition of his love for his grandchildren meant more than any legal mercy could have provided. Bobby had come to court prepared to accept punishment, but instead had found validation for his values and support for his continuing efforts to provide for the children who depended on him. Judge Caprio's voice, when he responded to Bobby's thanks, carried the warmth of someone speaking to a beloved family member. Frank explained that Bobby's story had reminded him of the fundamental reasons he had chosen to dedicate his life to the law. Not to punish people for desperate circumstances, but to find ways to support and strengthen the bonds that held families and communities together. The judge spoke of his own experience as a grandfather, acknowledging the profound love and sense of responsibility that connected him to his own grandchildren. Frank explained that Bobby's willingness to risk legal consequences rather than allow Maria and Carlos to go hungry represented the kind of sacrifice that had sustained families throughout history and deserved celebration rather than punishment. As Bobby gathered his belongings, including the photograph of his grandchildren that had remained beside him throughout the proceedings, the transformation in his demeanor was clearly visible to everyone present. The worried, careful elderly man had been replaced by someone who walked taller, moved with more confidence, and radiated the kind of peace that came from knowing that love's most important battles had been won. The impact of Judge Caprio's decision extended far beyond Bobby's individual case as people throughout the courtroom began to process what they had witnessed. Court officers who had seen thousands of cases found themselves reflecting on their own family relationships and the lengths they would go to protect their loved ones. Attorneys waiting for their own cases discovered that their usual focus on legal strategies had been replaced by considerations of compassion, family responsibility, and the proper role of justice in supporting rather than undermining community values. Citizens in the gallery began sharing quiet conversations about their own experiences with elderly family members, their understanding of the challenges facing grandparents raising grandchildren, and their recognition of the quiet heroism that people like Bobby demonstrated every day. The veteran's story had awakened in many people a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made by elderly family members and a renewed commitment to supporting those who took on such responsibilities. The practical implications of Judge Caprio's decision would extend far into Bobby's future. The $200 for groceries would provide immediate relief, but more importantly, the connections Frank had promised to local social service organizations would create ongoing support systems that could help Bobby navigate the challenges of raising young children on a fixed income. Local news media, who had been covering routine court proceedings, suddenly found themselves with a story that captured something essential about human nature, community values, and the potential for institutions to serve as forces for good in people's lives. The combination of Bobby's sacrifice and Judge Caprio's compassionate response created a narrative that resonated far beyond the confines of traffic court. The emotional resonance of Bobby's case also sparked broader conversations about the challenges facing elderly Americans who found themselves responsible for raising grandchildren, often with limited resources and support. His story highlighted both the dedication of grandparents who stepped forward in times of family crisis and the need for community systems that could better support these heroic efforts. As Bobby prepared to leave the courtroom, he turned back toward Judge Caprio one final time, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture that conveyed more gratitude than words could express. Frank responded with his own gentle nod and warm smile, acknowledging the bond of understanding that had been created between them and the shared commitment to values that transcended individual circumstances. The elderly veteran's slow progress toward the courtroom doors was marked by nods and smiles from everyone he passed, people who recognized in his story reflections of their own family experiences and their own understanding of what it meant to love someone completely and unconditionally. Bobby's dignity in the face of adversity had inspired not just judicial compassion, but community recognition of values that deserved celebration and support. Judge Caprio returned to his bench to continue the day's docket, but the atmosphere in his courtroom had been permanently changed by what had just occurred. Subsequent cases were handled with even greater attention to the human stories behind legal violations, inspired by Bobby's reminder that every person who appeared before the court carried their own complex circumstances and deserved to be treated with dignity and understanding. The ripple effects of the morning's events would extend far beyond the courthouse walls, as Bobby's story began to spread through the community and eventually around the world. What had started as a simple traffic violation had become a powerful testament to the enduring strength of family love, the importance of supporting those who sacrificed for others, and the potential for justice to serve not just legal requirements, but the deepest needs of the human heart. Bobby Martinez left the courthouse that morning carrying not just the relief of resolved legal issues and the practical gift of grocery money, but the profound satisfaction of having his values recognized and celebrated by someone in authority. His love for Maria and Carlos had been transformed from a private family matter into a public celebration of the bonds that connected generations and the sacrifices that sustained families through difficult times. The story of the 88-year-old veteran who sped to feed his grandchildren and received not punishment but praise would become a lasting reminder that in every interaction between citizens and institutions lay the potential for recognition, respect, and mutual support that strengthened the fabric of society itself. Bobby's quiet heroism had inspired judicial compassion that would be remembered as an example of justice at its finest, protecting the vulnerable, celebrating love, and creating hope where there had been fear and desperation. The impact of Bobby Martinez's court appearance and Judge Frank Caprio's compassionate response began to spread almost immediately, creating ripples that would eventually touch millions of lives around the world. What had started as a simple traffic violation in a Rhode Island municipal court evolved into something far more significant. A story that captured the essence of family love, sacrifice, and the potential for human institutions to serve the deepest needs of the human spirit. Within hours of leaving the courthouse, Bobby returned to his modest apartment where 8-year-old Maria and 6-year-old Carlos were waiting with their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had volunteered to watch them during their grandfather's court appearance. The children's excited reaction to the grocery money their grandfather had received created a moment of pure joy that reminded Bobby why every sacrifice had been worth making. That evening, as Bobby prepared dinner using ingredients purchased, with Judge Caprio's gift, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected kindness he had encountered. The elderly veteran had lived long enough to understand that such moments were rare and precious, deserving of gratitude that extended far beyond simple thanks. He wrote a letter to Judge Caprio, expressing in his careful handwriting appreciation not just for the financial assistance, but for the recognition and dignity the judge had shown him. Local television stations picked up Bobby's story within days, drawn by the combination of human interest and the judicial compassion that had resolved his case. The coverage expanded beyond simple news reporting to include features on the challenges facing grandparents raising grandchildren, the economic pressures on elderly Americans, and the importance of community support for families in transition. The story's emotional impact resonated far beyond Rhode Island's borders, as social media sharing and national news coverage brought Bobby and Maria and Carlos's situation to international attention. People around the world found themselves moved by the image of an 88-year-old veteran willing to risk legal consequences rather than allow his grandchildren to go hungry, and inspired by Judge Caprio's response that honored both legal requirements and human compassion. Donations began arriving at the courthouse within a week from people who had heard Bobby's story and wanted to contribute to his grandchildren's welfare. Judge Caprio worked with local social service organizations to establish a fund that could provide ongoing support for Bobby's family, while also assisting other grandparents facing similar challenges. The fund became a lasting legacy of Bobby's courage and the community's response to his situation. Educational institutions embraced Bobby's story as a teaching tool about American values, family responsibility, and the importance of supporting elderly community members. Schools throughout Rhode Island and beyond invited Bobby to speak about his military service, his experience raising grandchildren, and the importance of never giving up when people you love are depending on you. The practical support systems that Judge Caprio had promised materialized through partnerships with local organizations. Bobby was connected with programs that provided assistance with childcare, educational support for Maria and Carlos, and resources that helped him navigate the complex challenges of raising children in the 21st century while living on a fixed income. Military veterans organizations throughout New England embraced Bobby as a symbol of continuing service and sacrifice that extended far beyond formal military duty. His willingness to take on the challenges of raising young children at age 88 was recognized as another form of service to family and community that deserved honor and support. These organizations began developing programs specifically designed to assist elderly veterans facing similar family responsibilities. The grocery store where Bobby had shopped on that fateful Sunday evening learned of his story through media coverage and reached out to offer ongoing discounts for veterans and seniors raising grandchildren. The manager, moved by Bobby's dedication to his grandchildren, established a special assistance program that ensured no elderly caregiver would face the crisis that had led to Bobby's speeding violation. Judge Caprio's handling of Bobby's case became a cornerstone example in judicial education programs throughout the United States demonstrating how judges could balance legal requirements with human compassion to achieve outcomes that served both individual needs and broader community values. Law schools began using the case to teach students about the role of discretion in judicial decision-making and the importance of understanding the human context behind legal violations. The emotional impact on Judge Caprio himself was profound and lasting. Frank later described Bobby's case as one of the most meaningful of his career, reinforcing his belief that the law should serve to strengthen rather than burden the bonds between family members. The case validated his approach to justice and inspired him to continue looking for opportunities to use judicial authority for positive community impact. Local religious congregations adopted Bobby's story as an inspiration for their own family support programs. Churches, synagogues, and mosques throughout Rhode Island began organizing assistance programs for elderly grandparents raising grandchildren, providing everything from childcare support to emergency grocery funds modeled after Judge Caprio's spontaneous generosity. Maria and Carlos themselves became indirect ambassadors for the values their grandfather represented. Their academic success, made possible by Bobby's sacrifices and the community support inspired by his story, served as testament to the positive outcomes that could result when society rallied around families in need. Their teachers noted improvements in both children's confidence and academic performance, following the resolution of their family's legal and financial worries. The case study of Bobby's situation was adopted by social service agencies as an example of how elderly caregivers could be better supported in their efforts to provide stable homes for displaced children. Programs were developed to identify and assist grandparents facing similar challenges before financial pressures led to crisis situations like the one Bobby had experienced. National advocacy organizations for elderly Americans embraced Bobby's story as an illustration of both the challenges facing seniors on fixed incomes and the remarkable resilience and dedication that elderly people demonstrated when family responsibilities demanded their attention. His case became part of legislative testimony supporting increased assistance for grandparents raising grandchildren. The story also sparked broader conversations about traffic enforcement and the importance of considering human circumstances when applying legal penalties. Police departments throughout New England began training officers to recognize situations where citations might exacerbate rather than resolve underlying problems, encouraging discretion and referral to social services when appropriate. 5 years after his court appearance, Bobby remained active in caring for Maria and Carlos, now teenagers who had flourished under his loving guidance and the community support inspired by his story. The children's success in school and their obvious devotion to their grandfather served as ongoing testament to the power of love, sacrifice, and community support to transform challenging circumstances into positive outcomes. The Memorial Fund, established in Bobby's honor, had grown to assist dozens of families throughout Rhode Island, providing emergency assistance, educational support, and recognition for elderly caregivers who had stepped forward when family crises demanded their involvement. The fund embodied the values that Bobby's story had celebrated: love, sacrifice, and community responsibility for supporting those who cared for others. Judge Caprio, now retired from active service, continued to cite Bobby's case as an example of why he had devoted his career to compassionate justice. The story remained a favorite in his speaking engagements, where he used it to illustrate how individual cases could become catalysts for positive change when handled with wisdom, empathy, and recognition of the values that bound communities together. Bobby's story had evolved from a potential legal disaster into a celebration of American values that transcended individual circumstances. His willingness to risk consequences rather than allow his grandchildren to go hungry had inspired a judicial response that honored both legal requirements and human dignity, creating a legacy that continued to benefit families throughout the region. The 88-year-old veteran who had sped to feed his grandchildren had become more than just a traffic court defendant. He had become a symbol of the quiet heroism that elderly Americans demonstrated every day, the enduring power of family, love, and the potential for institutions to serve not just legal requirements, but the deepest needs of the human heart. Bobby Martinez's legacy reminded all who heard his story. That age need not diminish one's capacity for love and service, that family responsibilities were sacred trusts that deserved community support, and that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism were performed not by those seeking recognition, but by those simply trying to care for the people they loved most. The ripples of grace that began in Judge Caprio's courtroom on that November morning continued to spread, touching new lives and inspiring fresh commitments to the values that make families strong and communities resilient. Bobby's story had become a permanent reminder that individual acts of love and sacrifice, when met with institutional compassion, could create lasting positive change that benefited entire communities for generations to come. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.